Thank you for choosing my video to watch. I appreciate this very much. Here we have 3 scary stories based on working at night. Do any of you work nights? If so, how do you feel about it? Please comment below. As Stephen arrived at the hospital for his final night shift, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The dimly lit corridors seemed to be closing in on him, and the soft sounds of the hospital equipment echoed with an eerie quality that made him shiver. Unbeknownst to anyone, Stephen had a dark and twisted secret that he'd kept hidden for far too long. It had all started with his first kill, a rush of unbridled power that he simply couldn't resist. As the body count grew, Stephen found that he enjoyed his newfound sense of control and domination over those he preyed upon. But now, as he prepared to move on to a new job and a fresh start, he knew that he couldn't run from his past forever. As Stephen made his rounds through the silent wards of the hospital, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was stalking him. A low growling sound seemed to follow him wherever he went, and the flickering of the overhead lights cast eerie shadows on the walls. It wasn't until he reached the end of his shift that the full horror of his situation dawned on him. As he turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind him, and Stephen found himself face to face with the ghost of his most recent victim. The woman's face was twisted in a rictus of pain and fear, her eyes burning with a cold, malevolent light. "You thought you could hide from me, Stephen," the ghost whispered, her voice filled with icy malice. "But I will always be with you, haunting your every step until you pay for your crimes." Stephen tried to run, but the ghost pursued him relentlessly through the twisting corridors of the hospital, her phantom hands reaching out to claw at his flesh. In the end, he collapsed in a crumpled heap, gasping for air as the ghost vanished into the shadows. But even as Stephen lay there, trembling and broken, he knew that he could never truly escape his past. The ghost would always haunt him, a reminder of the terrible things he had done and the darkness that lurked within him. And as the hospital slowly faded to black around him, Stephen knew that he was trapped, caught forever in the grip of his own twisted nightmares. As the night wore on, Stephen's sense of unease only grew. The hospital was not what it seemed. It was alive, breathing, and watching his every move. The walls seemed to be closing in on him, the air thickening with the stench of death and decay. Suddenly, Stephen heard a faint whispering in his ear. It was a voice he recognized all too well. The ghost of his victim had returned, and this time she was not alone. The other ghosts of his victims appeared before him, their faces twisted in agony and despair. They wailed and moaned, the sound growing louder and more cacophonous with each passing moment. The walls shook and the lights flickered, threatening to plunge Stephen into complete darkness. The hospital was a cursed place, a gateway to the underworld. The ghosts of those Stephen had murdered were bound to the hospital, and they were not content to let him leave alive. Stephen tried to run, but the ghosts were too powerful. They dragged him back, their phantom hands reaching into his body and tearing him apart from the inside out. He screamed, but no sound escaped his lips. The ghosts were devouring him, consuming his soul and feeding on his pain and suffering. As Stephen died, he realized the true horror of his situation. The darkness that he had unleashed was not just a part of him. It was a force beyond his control, a malevolent entity that would continue to torment the living long after he was gone. I hope you enjoy the content I upload. If you like what I'm doing, why not think about clicking on the subscribe button to keep up to date on my uploads. Thank you all for the great support. Stephanie was a brave girl, or so she thought. But as she entered the mental asylum for her very first night shift, she couldn't help but feel a sense of dread creeping over her. The building was old and creaky, with shadows that seemed to move and shift as she passed. It was as if the asylum itself was alive and watching her every move. Taking a deep breath, Stephanie composed herself and began to make her rounds. As she walked down the dimly lit hallways, she could hear the moans and screams of the patients echoing off the walls. Some were sleeping, while others were in the throes of their madness. Stephanie tried to ignore their cries and keep walking, but the sound sent shivers down her spine. As the night wore on, Stephanie began to feel a growing sense of unease. Strange noises were coming from the empty hallways, and the lights flickered and dimmed. She wondered if she was alone in this place, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Suddenly, Stephanie heard a piercing scream coming from one of the cells. Her heart racing, she quickly ran toward the sound, her phone at the ready to dial 911. But when she opened the door of the cell, she was horrified to find that there was no one there. It was as if the scream had come from another dimension entirely. Despite her fear, Stephanie knew that she had to keep going. She continued to make her rounds, checking each and every cell, but she still couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It was as if someone, or something, was following her every move. As she made her way back to the nurse's station, Stephanie heard a faint whisper behind her. She turned around and saw an old woman's face staring back at her from the darkness. The woman's eyes were a deep red, and her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. It was a smile that seemed to say, "I've been waiting for you." With a scream, Stephanie turned and ran, her feet pounding against the floor as she tried to escape. But the old woman was right behind her, chasing her down the dark and endless hallways of the asylum. She could hear the woman's raspy breath and her gnarled hands reaching out, ready to snatch her. Terrified, Stephanie stumbled and fell, hitting her head on the ground. As her vision started to fade, she could see the old woman looming over her face twisted into an evil sneer. She knew then that she was going to die and that her fate was sealed. Stephanie never made it out of the mental asylum. Her disappearance was shrouded in mystery, and no one ever found out what really happened to her on that fateful night shift. But some say that if you enter the asylum at the stroke of midnight, you can still hear her screams echoing throughout the empty halls, and see the old woman's face staring back at you from the darkness.